Welcome back to Notes on the Nervous System. This is video 2. And in this video, we're going to look at how the nervous system is organized and focus on the central nervous system, specifically the brain. And again, there's lots of really cool information about the brain, so I'm just really trying to hit the high points in these videos. First, you have this diagram that shows how the nervous system is organized. So here you've got your little person over here, and these are the different divisions of the nervous system. It's important to think about just basically how the nervous system works. You receive, remember, and we talked kind of about this with reflexes, with the muscular system. But think about, when you're seeing something, you're sending, all of your senses are involved in gathering information, whether it be vision or hearing or touching or tasting or smelling. And so that's all sending information to your brain. Your brain is the thing that organizes it and decides what to do with the information it's getting. And then it will send impulses out to respond to the information that it's getting from your senses. So there's always this movement of impulses going in towards the brain and then out away from the brain to respond. So it's all about a response, a stimulus and a response, or a cause and an effect. So keep that in mind. And so you'll see these arrows here that we're going to fill in with color here in a little bit to talk about information that's coming towards the brain or away from the brain. So you have your two main divisions here are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Remember when we did the bones, how I talked to you about the vertebrae protect the spinal cord? And remember there's that big hole in the base at the bottom part, the posterior part of your skull, and that's where your spinal cord comes in and connects to your brain. So it's all connected. And that's your central nervous system. It's kind of the center, main axis or center of your body, deciding what's going to be happening with the rest of your body. The peripheral nervous system is everything that's outside the central nervous system. If you see something in your peripheral vision, like I'm moving my hand now towards my head, and I can see my hand right here. If I'm staring straight ahead, the first time I see it, even though I'm not looking straight centrally at my hand, I can still see it in my peripheral vision. So periphery means to the side. So the peripheral nervous system is everything to the side or outside of your central nervous system. And that consists of all of the nerves that aren't in the brain or the spinal cord. You do have some nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves, but all the nerves in your hands, in your muscles, all the other places in your body, if they're not in the brain and spinal cord, then they make up the peripheral nervous system. So these are the nerves, the peripheral nervous system, are the ones that communicate between the rest of your body and your central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is then divided up into different sections depending on what they do and if they're voluntary or not. Because remember, you can control your muscles. So that remember that is that voluntary or involuntary? Right, muscle, what you can control is voluntary. The first division then of these peripheral nerves are, is it involved in sensation, sensing things? Or is it involved in moving things? Motor means to move. So you've got the nerves that are either involved in sensing something or moving something. The sensory division is also called the afferent. See that word afferent. The motor division is efferent. So the sensory division sends impulses from the senses to the central nervous system. So the nerves that are coming from your eyes, from your ears, from your hands, your skin, your nose, your tongue, all of those nerves that are going from there to the sense organs to the brain, that's part of the sensory or afferent division. Now, if it involves nerves that are coming from things that move, then it would be the motor or efferent division. Notice there's only one letter difference. So these send impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles and the glands. For muscles and glands to work, they have to get an impulse from the brain. So remember, the sensory is taking information to the brain, and motor is bringing things from the brain to the rest of your body. Here is where we have to decide the further division takes place of, is it something that happens automatically, which is involuntary, or is it something that happens where I can think about it and control it? Remember, there are muscles that you can control and the muscles that you cannot control. The ones that you cannot control are part of the autonomic nervous system. So these are involuntary muscle control. Now, I squished this box. You can twirl it to fit inside this rectangle. I had to turn it to the side based on this picture. You can do it either way, as long as you understand that autonomic is stuff you cannot control. So which muscles are involuntary? Make your choice there. So yes, it's going to be the cardiac muscles, remember the ones of your heart, and also of the muscles of your organs. You can't control those. So they would have the nerves that are part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, they can either make things go faster or make things chill out. That's where these two divisions are. So the sympathetic, rewind, I decided to do this instead. So autonomic is involuntary, you can't control those, versus the skeletal muscles are the ones you can control. So the nerves that you have in your muscles are part of the somatic nervous system, which are the nerves, motor nerves that you can control. So you get, let's say you see a tiger and you need to run. So the sensory division is where you're using your eyes. And so those nerves, the sensory nerves from your eyes, are going to be here in this division. They're going to travel through the rest of your body to the spinal cord and tell your brain, and you're going to understand, that's a tiger, I need to run, he's going to hurt me. So then it's going to send a message down, back through the peripheral nervous system, through the spinal cord, to the motor division to send an impulse to your skeletal muscles, and you're going to know how to run to get away. It'll also send some information to some of your glands to help you speed things up. Adrenaline, that's what adrenaline is. It's from the adrenal gland. So let's now look here at what's you can't control. Sometimes you need to speed things up, and sometimes you need to slow them down. If we're thinking about that tiger, so yes, you can move. It goes down through your motor division, but they also will have nerves going through the autonomic or the involuntary, because you need to get blood quickly to your muscles. You need to get oxygen quickly to the rest of your body. You need to get oxygen quickly. So these things that you can't control, your heartbeat and your breathing, those need to increase when you're trying to run away from a tiger. And so these involuntary things are going to be part of the sympathetic division. You may have heard of the fight or flight situation. That means that your heart rate, your blood pressure, all these things are going to increase so that you can make the decision, okay, do I fight the tiger or do I run away? If I fight it, I'm going to need strength to fight it, and lots of oxygen to my brain to make sure I have plenty, make good decisions. So that's the fight part of it. So that will increase to help you fight. But if you decide I need to run away because it's probably going to eat me if I fight it, then you need to increase these things to actually be fast and run away. So regardless of if you're going to fight or flight, you need some of these involuntary actions to speed up for you to do what your brain is telling you to do. Other times, you want to slow it down. You can't stay at this hyped up fight or flight situation constantly. So once the danger has passed, then your body needs to come back down and chill out. And that's what the parasympathetic division does. So let those words get out of the way. and you'll drag that box. Reduces the sympathetic response, provides resting functions such as digestion and urination. When you gotta pee, let's say I've got to pee, but I see the tiger. I'm more concerned about getting away from the tiger than I am peeing. So I will kind of forget about the need to pee while I deal with the emergency situation. And then when the parasympathetic kicks in and I'm calming down again, I'm like, oh yeah, I do have to pee. I need to go pee. Or digesting food is the same thing. It's more important for you to survive something like that and not be killed than to digest the spaghetti I ate for lunch. So that's what the difference is here. So all these different parts of your nervous system work together for you to actually survive and do the things that you need to do. So we'll come back to some of these things later and focus on different parts, but we're going to focus next on the brain. So our next diagram, oh, sorry, I forgot. So you're going to be filling in the arrows. You're supposed to color the arrows blue that are sending messages to the brain. So these arrows, if you just click on the arrow once, and then you can click on the paint bucket to make it colored. So color these two arrows blue because they're sending information toward the brain. And then the rest of the arrows are all dealing with information from the brain, and so they will all be red. So make all those red. Okay, now we can look at the brain. So here is a picture of looking at the inside of the brain. Now I have a brain model right here. Okay, and one of our labs for this unit is dissecting a sheep brain. So if you're in class, you'll be able to do that. So here's the brain. This view that you have is the inside. So I'm going to separate the halves. Remember, you have two halves of the brain. And it's being cantankerous right now. There. And so what you're looking at here is this view of the brain. So I'll come back to this after we label the parts. Now, this large portion that has all the squiggly stuff, this is called the cerebrum. That is the biggest part of your brain, and it consists of 4 different lobes, and these are named according to the bone that is protecting it. So remember, the frontal bone is this front part, this bone right here, and underneath it is protecting the frontal lobe. So move the frontal lobe over here. Then the very top part of your head, these two are the parietal bones, remember? So they are protecting the parietal lobe. So this is kind of in the top middle of your head, where your brain is. What's that bone at the back of your skull? What is that one called? Yes, the occipital bone. So it is protecting the occipital lobe of your cerebrum. The fourth one is on the side of your head right here. Remember, this is the temporal bone right above your ear. So the temporal lobe of your brain is right underneath that. And we're going to talk about what each one of those controls here in a minute. But since we're looking at the side view, we can't see the temporal lobe. So that makes up your cerebrum. This little thing at the base of your brain, right at the base of your skull, and if you feel where your vertebrae kind of go in, it would be right under there. This is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. You saw me struggling to pull apart the two halves of the brain. Both halves of your brain are connected by tissue. And so when you get information on one from nerves that go to one side of your brain, they can actually move across to the other half of your brain through this piece of tissue called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. And if you do dissect a sheep brain, you'll see that you have to cut through that all the way to separate the two halves of the brain. And it's the same way in the human. So that's what connects the two. And then you have this structure here, which is called the thalamus. The thalamus. And then right underneath it would be the hypothalamus. The hypo means below. So hypothalamus here is below the thalamus. And connected to the hypothalamus is a very important gland, and we'll talk more about that in the endocrine system, but it is called the pituitary gland. So that's kind of what's called the midbrain. This right here makes up the brain stem. It looks like the stem of a flower, so that's why they call it that. And the two main parts are this round structure here called the pons. And then right here is the medulla oblongata. And these are very important in involuntary functions such as breathing, heart rate, all of those important things that we can't control. So if you have damage in the brainstem, it's not very good for you. You will most likely not survive that. Well, not most likely, you will not survive that. And then this last thing here continues on down, and that is your spinal cord. So let's look at these structures on the model. If I can get up close, I might need to turn. There, you can see it better without the light. So all of this stuff here is the cerebrum. So you can see if you look at the other side, all of this is here. This is the temporal lobe that you can't see in this picture, but you can see in the model. This right here is the cerebellum. So you'd have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe up here, the occipital lobe at the back, and again, the temporal lobe would be on the side of your brain. Here is the cerebellum. Then get closer. Then you've got this structure here is that piece of material that connects the two halves or hemispheres of your brain. This is the corpus callosum. Then this would be the thalamus. You can tell the thalamus because of that dot, and you can also see it in this picture on your handout here. So this is the thalamus, and then you've got the hypothalamus right here. And this has the pituitary gland right there. It's a little pink thing. So pituitary gland, hypothalamus, thalamus. And then the brainstem, you have the pons right there. This is the medulla oblongata. And then the spinal cord right there. So these are the different parts of the interior structure of the brain. The next view is kind of squished. I'm sorry, but it's the best picture I had. Here's the cerebellum again. Here's the cerebrum and the other parts we've already talked about. This picture is talking or labeling covering the membranes of the brain. And also, you have spaces in your brain, and these spaces are filled with fluid. And that fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, and it circulates throughout your brain and spinal cord to nourish your brain. It brings a lot of nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide that you need for survival. Excuse me. If you have ever had a spinal puncture, or where they've had to take cerebrospinal fluid out, lumbar puncture, they're actually putting a needle in the spaces that we're fixing to label to draw out some of that cerebrospinal fluid. If you have to get tested for meningitis is an inflammation of these membranes called meninges, then they will go in a needle and take some of that fluid out of your spinal cord, not in your cord, but around the spaces there. So we're going to start up here. This is your scalp. This line right here is showing the scalp. Time to go home. Then this line is pointing to your skull. So you can kind of see this is what we're looking at. So we've cut through the skull there to see that. Now, the membranes that are covering, you've got one really hard membrane that covers right underneath, it's actually right underneath the skull, and that's called, the dura mater. Dura mater. This is actually German. It means hard mother because it's a really thick membrane. The next layer is called the inner layer that's actually connected to your brain. If you were to pull a brain out of a skull, you would have this really thin, almost like a plastic wrap covering the brain. That's the pia mater. That means soft mother. And between that, you have what's called the arachnoid space. Now, these are teeny tiny spaces, and they're just barely separated by these membranes. Then below that, arachnoid space, you have the subarachnoid space. Remember, sub means below. And there's also a space underneath the dura, the subdural space. Sometimes people have head injuries in this space, and they have a head injury and a blood clot can form. Anytime you break blood vessels, you're going to have blood coming out, and your body naturally wants to stop the bleeding, so it makes that blood clot. And so a bruise, if you think about a bruise, it's simply broken blood vessels underneath your skin. So if there's a major head injury and they have a really big clump of blood or big bruise, sometimes it can accumulate in this space, and that's what a subdural hematoma is. So these are all the different spaces, and there's a couple of places to label called the foramen of Monro, is this little opening here. And then the choroid plexus is this structure here. This is what actually is a group of cells that actually makes the cerebrospinal fluid. So it makes the fluid that's circulating in the brain down the spinal cord and back up into the brain. And you can't really see that here because we're looking at a side view or a sagittal cut, mid-sagittal cut. But if we were to pull this area out, we would see these spaces in the brain. And those are called ventricles. So you have the lateral ventricle right here because it's to the side. It opens up to the side. The third ventricle is in this spot. And then the fourth ventricle is right here in front of the cerebellum. So once again, these are the different membranes that cover the brain and the skull and create these spaces for cerebrospinal fluid to circulate within the brain and keep the brain nourished. Our last diagram here is looking at the different lobes of the cerebrum. What is their function? What are they most responsible for, the different things? So here's the spinal cord, here's the cerebellum. So the rest of this is the cerebrum, and you've got the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. The frontal lobe is responsible for all the voluntary movements you do, for coordinating those. Your reasoning and decisions that you make are come from your frontal lobe of your cerebrum. Your memory, your ability to predict consequences, your planning, and your verbal communication. So this part of your brain is where you do the highest order of thinking skills. This part of your brain is not fully developed until you are in your 20s. So I know a lot of you make really good decisions, but it's honestly not your fault when you do stupid things at this point in your life because your frontal lobe has not been completely developed. Now, hopefully by the time you get into your 20s and 30s, you realize, you start making better decisions. Your memory gets a little better. You can predict things better. So all of these higher order thinking skills are due to your frontal lobe working properly. And I'm not going to tell you to blame it on your frontal lobe, but if your parents ever say anything like, why can't you do this? Say, well, my frontal lobe just isn't quite developed yet, but don't get in trouble. I didn't say that. So that's your frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is involved in your sensations, feeling the sensation, your visual spatial processing. So understanding, like when you look at something in the distance, understanding that it's about that far away or if something's close to you. So just how things are in space and how your eyes tell you that information. And then also your body position, understanding that I'm standing upright right now, or if I tip my head, then I will understand that that's part of how I'm angled. And so that's the parietal lobe is what tells me that. The occipital lobe is involved in visual processing. So the vision and memory of objects. So when you look at something and you know that that's a cow, then that's because your occipital lobe of your brain has learned that configuration of lines and things and maybe what the sounds that it makes, that's a cow because someone taught you that. So when someone teaches you something, your neurons connect and make, they remember these things these connections that you're making, and the neurotransmitters are being sent around to make these connections so that you'll keep knowing that that's what that is. Obviously, a lot of this is going on when you're growing up as a little kid. I'm going to do this one. This one is next. Your cerebellum is this part right here, and that's your coordination. Coordinates movements that the cerebrum tells you to do so that you're graceful and efficient when you move. So your brain thinks, oh, your voluntary movement. So your frontal lobe is saying, okay, you need to hold your hands this way and swing a bat just like that to hit the ball. And so it's sending information to your cerebellum so that you can do it and not fall over. Kind of when you follow through with your swing, you know when to stop with your other muscles so that you don't fall over and twirl around. So that's your cerebellum. Also, involuntary movements and what your muscle memory is. When you start riding a bike, you learn how it's kind of awkward, but once you do it over and over again, you develop what's called muscle memory, and it just kind of does it automatically. Even if you don't ride a bike for a couple of years, you can get back on a bike and ride one because of your cerebellum and how it has done this muscle memory stuff. Incidentally, when you drink too much alcohol, it affects your cerebellum pretty quick. And so that's why people that are drunk don't have good balance, because their cerebellum is not working very good. This is pointing to the brainstem, located just above the spinal cord. It controls your involuntary activities, like I mentioned already, your breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, and swallowing. Very, very important part of your brain. And then the temporal lobe here is the last one of the cerebrum, and that's where you have also memory being controlled, comprehension, and pronouncing words. So understanding what a word means when you see it, that's part of your temporal lobe. The sensations of smell and sound. We had vision was being involved with your occipital lobe at the back of your brain, but understanding smells and recognizing them and sounds are all from your temporal lobe. And then the emotional association of memories. So you may think, oh, I remember when my grandma made that banana bread. It was the best banana bread, and that makes me feel really good about that. So remembering that and the emotions you feel are done in the temporal lobe. Or it may not be a good memory. It may be a bad memory. If you see something or hear something, you remember it and you have a bad feeling about it, that's your temporal lobe telling you that information. Sorry. And the last thing to put in here is just telling you the cerebrum has those 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So this is your amazing brain. You could spend years studying just one part of it, and people do. But it's just, I want you to really understand and appreciate the brain for what it is, and how we do a lot of things to it that can affect these different parts. If you have a stroke in a certain part of a brain, it's going to affect the function that's associated with that lobe as well. Hope you learned something with this video, and we will pick up in video 3 with the peripheral nervous system.